Namaskar students, we'll continue with the same lesson, life process. And in the previous class you have already studied the different methods of nutrition in plants and animals. Now we will be discussing respiration in plants and animals. This respiration is also a very important life process in the life of all the living organisms, whether it is plants or animal. Respiration is the breakdown of organic substance like glucose to release energy in the form of ATP. To release energy in the form of ATP. This ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and the energy released by this process, that is in the form of ATP, it is utilized for doing various cellular activities within our body. The various metabolic activities that are going inside our body, they use the energy in the form of ATP. Now, during the process of respiration, the substance which is oxidized or undergo the process of breakdown, this substance, it is called as the respiratory substrate. It is called as respiratory substrate. Right. Now, this process of respiration, an organism can respire in the presence of oxygen, or an organism can respire in the absence of oxygen also. Suppose an organism is respiring in the presence of oxygen, then we call it as aerobic respiration. And if an organism is respiring in the absence of oxygen, we call it as anaerobic respiration. Right? Now, in both the cases, the breakdown of glucose will take place. In the first case, in the presence of oxygen, and in the second case, in the absence of oxygen. Right. Now, different pathways for the breakdown of glucose. Let us see what are these pathways. See here, glucose is a 6-carbon compound, right? Now we are going to break down this glucose, and let us see what are the different methods by which it can be broken down, right? Glucose is a 6-carbon compound, right? See here, this glucose is the same glucose that you have obtained in the process of nutrition when the process of digestion was completed. And then the carbohydrate was broken down into glucose. The carbohydrate was broken down into glucose, fat into fatty acid and glycerol, then protein into amino acid. This is the same glucose that we have obtained after the digestion was completed, and after the absorption process, this glucose was absorbed in the small intestine by the villi, and then it was transported to the entire part of the body, and all the cells received this glucose. Now in this process of respiration, what we are going to do? We are going to break this glucose, right? Now what are the different pathways with which this glucose can be broken down? Now let us see. See here, the first step in the breakdown of the glucose is the glucose will be broken down into pyruvic acid. You can also call it as pyruvate. This is a 3-carbon compound, right? Glucose is a 6-carbon compound, and it will be broken down into pyruvic acid, which is a 3-carbon compound, right? This process will take place in the cytoplasm. Now the process of breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid, it is also called as glycolysis. Now what happens? See, after the glucose has been converted into pyruvic acid, now there are 2 possibilities. This pyruvic acid may receive, if it is getting oxygen, if an organism is respiring in the presence of oxygen, then how the breakdown of pyruvic acid will take place? Just see here, suppose an organism is respiring in the presence of oxygen. An organism is respiring in the presence of oxygen. At this time what happened? The product form will be, that is pyruvic acid, will be broken down into carbon dioxide, water and energy. And energy will be liberated, right? But if the pyruvic acid is broken down in the presence of oxygen, this reaction will take place in the mitochondria. mitochondria of the cell, this reaction will take place and carbon dioxide, water and energy will be liberated. This is a process of this process of respiration, it is also called as the aerobic process of respiration. Another possibility, if an organism is respiring in the absence of oxygen, absence of oxygen, if an organism is respiring in the absence of oxygen, at that time what happens, the product, the pyruvic acid will be broken down into ethanol, CO2, and energy will be liberated. This type of respiration, it takes place in the body of yeast. Ethanol, pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon compound, whereas ethanol is a 2-carbon compound, right? And it takes place in the body of the yeast, and this process, it is also called as alcoholic fermentation, and this alcoholic fermentation process is also used in the commercial scale for the production of wine, beer and other alcoholic beverages. Now, there is another possibility also. See here, another possibility that takes place in the muscle cell, in the muscles cell. See what happens. Sometimes after vigorous exercise, oxygen demand of that person increases, but the available oxygen in the body is not that much sufficient for him to meet the oxygen demand, because he has done heavy exercise or after doing vigorous work, his oxygen demand is increasing. So at that time what happened, anyhow the athlete has to respire, right? So at that time what he is doing, he is respiring in the presence of insufficient supply of oxygen. He is respiring in the presence of insufficient supply of oxygen. At that time what happens, this pyruvic acid is broken down into lactic acid, and energy is liberated. This process is also called as lactic acid formation. Lactic acid is also a 3-carbon compound. Now this type of reaction also takes place in the body of certain anaerobic bacteria. These anaerobic bacteria, they metabolize the sugar. It causes the milk to become sour. How? These bacteria metabolize the sugar present in the milk and convert it into lactic acid. Due to the formation of lactic acid, the milk tastes sour. So this reaction takes place there also. It is called as lactic acid formation. Now these are the three ways by which the pyruvic acid can be broken down. But during the breakdown of the glucose, this is the common method, right? Glucose is broken into pyruvic acid, then these 3 possibilities are there. Now you can see here, see the product. Students, you should be very careful while writing the products of these 3 types of respiration. In case of the anaerobic respiration, the product is ethanol, carbon dioxide, energy. In the lack of oxygen, it is lactic acid and energy. Presence of oxygen, aerobic respiration taking place inside the mitochondria, it is carbon dioxide, water and energy. In all the cases, energy is liberated. Now you see here, the energy produced in case of the aerobic respiration is much higher as compared to the energy produced in case of the anaerobic respiration. Here, energy is produced in the form of ATP, that is 38 molecules of ATP is produced here, and in case of the anaerobic respiration, only 2 molecules of ATP is produced, right? Now this is regarding the different methods of breakdown of glucose. Children, now let us summarize the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, right? In case of the aerobic respiration, it takes place in the presence of oxygen and release large amount of energy, and anaerobic respiration, it occurs in the absence of oxygen and release relatively small amount of energy. Each glucose molecule breaks down to produce 38 molecules of ATP in case of the aerobic respiration, and in case of the anaerobic respiration, only 2 molecules of ATP is formed by the breakdown of 1 molecule of glucose. Now aerobic respiration, it begins in the cytoplasm and continues in the mitochondria, whereas anaerobic respiration, it occurs only in the cytoplasm. In case of the aerobic respiration, there is a complete breakdown of food occurs, whereas in case of the anaerobic respiration, only partial breakdown of the food occurs. Now the end product in case of the aerobic respiration is carbon dioxide and water, whereas in case of the anaerobic respiration, the end product is carbon dioxide, ethanol, or lactic acid. Aerobic respiration takes place in many plants and animals, whereas anaerobic respiration, it takes place in the body of the yeast and many anaerobic bacteria. Stages of respiration. The stages of respiration is basically of two types. The stages of respiration is basically of two types: external respiration and internal respiration. Among the external respiration is the process of breathing. Among the external respiration is the process of breathing and gaseous exchange. And gaseous exchange. During the process of breathing, what we are doing, we are taking in oxygen through our respiratory system and we are giving out the gas that is called as the carbon dioxide. Now the oxygen that we have taken in, this oxygen will move to the lungs, right? And the carbon dioxide from the entire part of the body will reach the lungs, right? This oxygen will reach the lungs from outside, and carbon dioxide from the entire body will move on to the lungs, and from the lungs it will be exhaled out. So breathing means taking in of oxygen and giving out of carbon dioxide, and in the gaseous exchange, it is from the lungs. See, oxygen comes into the lungs, and from the lungs, the diffusion of oxygen from the lungs to the blood vessel, it is called as gaseous exchange. It comes under gaseous exchange. The carbon dioxide will go into the lungs, and from the lungs it will be exhaled out of the body. So this is called as the gaseous exchange. In the internal respiration, we have, when the blood from the lungs, the oxygen goes through the blood, and then from the blood vessels or from the arterial blood, the movement of the oxygen from the arterial blood into the cells, from the arterial blood into the cell, it is called as internal respiration. The movement of oxygen from the arterial blood into the cell, it is called as internal respiration. Now let us see how the exchange of gases takes place in case of the plant. Now in case of the plant, the exchange of gases may take place through the leaves, or through the stem, or through the roots. In the leaves, what happens? Certain small pores called as the stomata. It is present in the epidermis. These stomata are present in the epidermis of the leaf, and they bring about the exchange of gases in case of the leaf, right? The stomata are the small aperture guarded by the two guard cell. The important function of stomata is, one is transpiration, the very important function you have studied in your class 9. The function of stomata, it is transpiration, and second one is the diffusion of gases. So here in this topic respiration, we will be dealing with the function of the stomata, that is diffusion of gases, right? So stomata helps in the diffusion of gases, that is carbon dioxide and oxygen. Now during daytime, what happens? During day, when photosynthesis activity is going on, carbon dioxide is taken in by the plant and oxygen move out of the plant, right? And then during the night, when there is no photosynthesis, at that time what happens? At that time the plant starts giving out carbon dioxide and start taking in oxygen. Now in the night, the carbon dioxide which is given out by the plant during the night is utilized by the plants during the day for the process of photosynthesis. Now during this exchange of gases, there is a stage in which the respiratory output of carbon dioxide is equal to the photosynthetic intake of carbon dioxide, and that particular stage is called as a compensation point. That particular stage or point, you can say, it is called as compensation point. It is called as a compensation point, right? Now how the gaseous exchange takes place in case of the stem? In case of the stem may, if if the stem is a herbaceous plant, if it is a herbaceous plant, then the exchange of gases can take place through the stomata, and if it is a woody or an older portion of the plant, then the exchange of gases takes place through another small opening, and this opening is called as lenticels, and these small openings which is present in the older portion of the plant or in the woody plant, they are called as the lenticels. It helps in the exchange of gases. Next, in plants, the exchange of gases also takes place through the roots. The roots of the plants are present underground, and the roots of the plant have certain small hair-like structure which is also called as the root hairs. These root hairs penetrate deep into the soil, and between the soil particle, air spaces are present, and they move into the air spaces, and what happened? They move into the air spaces and they take the oxygen. These root hair absorb the oxygen from these air spaces and then pass it on to the root cells, and passes on to the root cell, and from the root cell the carbon dioxide will be discharged into the root hair, and from the root hair the CO2 will be discharged into the air spaces. So this is how the exchange of gases occur in case of the leaves, stem and roots of the plant. Next is the exchange of gases in animals. The animals have evolved different organs for this process, and all these organs work together to form an organ system, and that makes up the respiratory system of an organism. So for the efficient gaseous exchange, the respiratory surface of an organism should be thin wall. It should be thin wall and very fine, because the exchange of gas, that is carbon dioxide and oxygen, is going to take place across the membrane. Then it should be moist to speed up the process of diffusion. It should have large surface area so that more surface area will be in contact with the oxygen rich atmosphere. Then it should have rich supply of blood. It should be highly vascular. Why? Because oxygen, carbon dioxide, everything has to be transported throughout in the body, throughout the body, only through the blood, right? Next is the exchange of, now how the exchange of gases is taking place in the, now let us see the aquatic organism, how the gaseous exchange is taking place in the aquatic animals. In the aquatic animals has to take up the oxygen which is present in the dissolved form in the water, right? And for example, fishes, what they do, they take up the oxygen which is present in the dissolved form in the water, they take up that water into their mouth and then pump that water into the gills, and from where the oxygen is extracted and pass on to the bloodstream and it is circulated in the body. The respiratory surface in case of the fish is the fishes are gills. The gills are feather-like structure with large surface area and rich in the blood supply large surface area to maximize so that more and more oxygen it can absorb, right? Then is the exchange of, how the exchange of gases is taking place in case of the terrestrial animals. The terrestrial organism, they take up the oxygen which is present in the environment for their respiration, right? Now let us see the respiratory surfaces in different animals. For example, amoeba, planaria, the respiratory surface is cell membrane. Earthworm, leech, it is moist skin. Fish and prawn, it is gills. For frog, it is moist skin and lungs. For grasshopper, mosquito, housefly, it is spiracles and air tube. For birds and mammals, it is lungs. So these are the different respiratory surfaces in different animals. Now let us see how the respiration, the process of respiration is taking place in our body, right? That is the human respiratory system. See, I have drawn a structure here. This is the structure showing the human respiratory system: nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, then trachea. The trachea is getting branched into bronchi. The bronchi further branches into bronchioles, and bronchioles further terminates to terminal bronchioles, and at the end of the terminal bronchioles are attached the certain balloon-like structure which is called as the alveoli, right? Now see here, in this human respirator, how we are respiring. We are taking in oxygen, right? We are taking in oxygen through the nostril, then it is passing on to the pharynx, and then Moving to the larynx. Larynx is, it is also called as the voice box. Here the just above the larynx is the epiglottis is present, which prevent the entry of the food into the windpipe. The windpipe is called as the trachea. The air passes through the trachea and moves into the bronchi. Now the trachea, it is surrounded by rings of cartilage, and hence this is the reason why this trachea do not collapse when there is less air inside it, right? And then the air passes into the bronchi. The oxygen that we are taking in passes into the bronchi, and through the bronchi it reaches the bronchioles, and then at the terminal portion of the bronchioles is present the alveoli, and the oxygen reaches at the alveoli. It is this point at the alveoli where the exchange of gases will take place, right? Diaphragm is present just below the lungs. It is a muscular structure to support the lungs, and both the lungs, it is covered inside a rib cage made up of small bones called as the ribs, right? Now the mechanism of gaseous exchange in human can be completed in 3 steps. These 3 steps are inhalation, then exchange of gases, and exhalation. During inhalation, what happens? The air is taken into the body through the nostril, where it is filtered by the hairs and the mucus. Then the air passes down through the trachea. The diaphragm contracts and flattens, and the chest cavity expands, and the volume of the lungs also increases. The air is sucked into the lungs, and it fills the alveoli. Next is the exchange of gases. The oxygen diffuses into the alveoli. The oxygen diffuses into the alveoli through the blood vessels. Now blood releases carbon dioxide into the alveoli that it brings from whole of the body. Hemoglobin in the blood takes up oxygen and carries it to the tissue which are deficient of oxygen. Now oxygen is then transported to all the cells in the body by respiratory pigment, that is hemoglobin, and due to diffusion pressure. Then is the process of exhalation. In exhalation, what is happening? The carbon dioxide is transported in dissolved form in the blood. From the blood, carbon dioxide passes into the alveoli. It passes into the alveoli. The diaphragm relaxes and becomes dome shaped. The chest cavity is compressed, and the air is forced out of the lungs into the atmosphere. So this is how the mechanism of gaseous exchange is taking place in human beings. Okay, so we have seen, students, here the types of respiration and how the respiration is taking place in the body of plants as well as animal. So we have this much in this class, and before winding up, I have a small assignment for you. You can take down these questions, or you can take the snapshot of these questions and try to solve them, and we'll be discussing in the next class. Thank you.